Welcome to Nightverse lore! Oh geez, another dimension of naps!
Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. The night river arrived. The moon forgot how to cast just one shadow. In the small coastal town of Millhaven, where salt air carried both the day's catch and yesterday's dreams, such mysteries were received with the quiet acceptance of people who lived between tides. The midwife, Elena, had delivered 3 generations of children in houses that creaked with ocean rhythms, but she paused when she lifted the newborn toward the window and saw 2 distinct silhouettes fall across the opposite wall. One shadow stretched familiar and dark, while its companion shimmered with an almost luminous quality, as if the moonlight itself had split to accommodate something it had never quite seen before. The baby in Elena's arms was perfectly formed, perfectly healthy. Yet something in River's presence felt like standing at the edge of vast water at twilight, where boundaries dissolved into something larger than understanding. River's mother. Sarah noticed it too as she reached for her child. Those dark eyes held depths that belonged to someone much older, not in a frightening way, but with the quiet knowing of an old soul who had chosen to return with memories of wholeness intact. When River looked at their mother, Sarah felt seen completely, not just her joy at their arrival, but her fears, her complicated love that included worry and hope in equal measure, her grief for the husband lost to the sea 2 years before. The grandmother arrived as dawn painted the harbor silver. Nana Rose was a woman who had spent 87 years learning the subtle languages of the world. How morning light spoke differently than evening light, how certain tides carried different gifts to shore. When she saw her grandchild and noticed how the early sun cast those same dual shadows, she nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had been expecting exactly this mystery. Some souls are born to be bridges, she whispered to Sarah. Cradling River with hands that had tended countless mysteries, they come knowing that nothing is ever just one thing. This little one will see what others miss, hold what others find too difficult. River grew in a house 3 blocks from the harbor, where wave sound provided constant lullaby. Millhaven existed in that liminal space, where ocean met land, where fishing boats returned each evening with holds full of both treasures and debris that the sea offered without discrimination. It was a place that understood tides, how water needed to retreat to return, how shores were shaped as much by what was taken as what was left behind. As a toddler, River displayed unusual attention. While other children chased the brightest toy or loudest sound, River seemed drawn to spaces between things. They would sit watching dust motes dance in afternoon sunlight, studying how shadows moved across kitchen floors as clouds passed overhead. Their first word wasn't mama or dada, but both, spoken while pointing at their reflection in a rain puddle that showed their face and the sky above. The first real sign of River's gift appeared on a grey Tuesday when they were 4. Sarah was having one of her difficult mornings, grief for River's father sitting heavy in her chest like a stone. She tried making breakfast while tears ran silently down her cheeks, thinking she was hiding her sadness. River walked into the kitchen and, without words, climbed onto a chair and wrapped small arms around their mother's waist. But instead of trying to cheer her up or asking why she was crying, River simply stood there, holding space for the sadness. After a few moments, they looked up with those deep, knowing eyes and said, "The sad is okay. Mama, it lives next to the love." Sarah stopped stirring oatmeal and looked down at her child, struck by the profound simplicity. River wasn't trying to fix her grief or make it disappear. They were acknowledging its presence, its right to exist alongside all the other feelings that lived in their small family. Something shifted in Sarah's chest then, not the disappearance of sadness, but a gentle expansion that made room for both grief and love, loss and gratitude. That evening, tucking River into bed, Sarah asked, "How did you know what I needed?" River considered this seriously, the way they considered most questions. "I could see both parts," they said finally. "The part that was sad about Daddy and the part that was happy about me." They were holding hands in your heart. As River grew, their gift became more apparent. They befriended the class outcast not from pity, but because they could see past defensive anger to the lonely child underneath. They were drawn to the elderly neighbor everyone else avoided, recognizing in Mrs. Patterson's sharp words the fear of someone who had outlived most loved ones and was protecting herself from further loss. The town began to notice River's unusual way of being. They were the child who could sit quietly with someone having a bad day without trying to fix it, who could celebrate with genuine joy without needing attention, who seemed to understand that every emotion was a visitor deserving courtesy, not a problem requiring solution. Nana Rose watched her grandchild's development with deep satisfaction. She had spent decades tending her garden, learning that the most beautiful flowers often grew from the richest compost, that death fed life in endless cycles of transformation. She recognized in River a kindred spirit, someone who understood intuitively what she had learned through careful observation. Wholeness included everything, rejected nothing, found beauty in the complete spectrum of existence. On quiet evenings, as sunset painted Millhaven's harbor and the lighthouse began its nightly vigil, River would sit with Nana Rose on the front porch, watching sky transition from blue to purple to star-filled black. These were moments when River felt most at home, surrounded by wave rhythm and the understanding presence of someone who saw them completely. The moon above continued its ancient practice, sometimes casting one shadow, sometimes two, always teaching the same quiet lesson to anyone willing to learn. Light and darkness were not enemies, but partners in the eternal dance of being. And true peace came not from choosing sides, but from embracing the beautiful, necessary wholeness of it all. The morning after those moonlit conversations, River followed the scent of damp earth to Nana Rose's garden, where the real lessons waited among rows of vegetables and flowers that seemed to understand secrets the house couldn't hold. This wasn't just any garden, but what Nana Rose quietly called her sanctuary of necessary transformations, where every plant told a story of becoming something more through accepting what others might discard. At the garden's heart sat a compost pile that breathed with quiet life. Warm to the touch even on cool mornings, River learned to approach it with reverence, understanding that this humble mound held the mystery of renewal itself. Kitchen scraps and fallen petals, yesterday's coffee grounds and autumn's spent leaves, all surrendered their individual forms to become rich. Dark soil that smelled of rain and possibility. This is how healing really works, Nana Rose explained, her weathered hands turning the compost with gentle precision. We don't throw away the difficult parts. We give them time and space to transform into something that can nourish new growth. River watched earthworms thread through the decomposing matter, tiny architects of transformation, and understood that nothing was ever truly lost, only changed into something else. Mrs. Chen appeared at the garden gate that first morning, like someone who had always belonged there, carrying a ceramic teapot, painted with cranes and wearing the kind of smile that held both welcome and sorrow in equal measure. She was a woman who had learned to tend grief the way others tended roses, with patience and without trying to rush the natural seasons of the heart. I lost my husband last winter, she told River simply, settling onto the wooden bench Nana Rose had placed beneath the old apple tree. Some days I feel like those bulbs underground waiting for spring. Other days I'm the compost, breaking down so something new can grow. She spoke without self-pity, the way she might describe the weather, and River felt drawn to her honesty, her willingness to name the full spectrum of her experience. Together, the three of them developed a rhythm that followed the garden's natural cycles. Mornings belonged to practical tending, watering the tomatoes that climbed their stakes like green prayers, deadheading flowers to encourage new blooms, harvesting herbs that released their secrets into the warming air. River learned that removing spent blossoms wasn't cruel but kind, a way of telling the plant that its work of beauty could continue. Mrs. Chen taught River to listen to plants with more than their ears. She would hum soft melodies while working, her voice creating a bridge between the human world and the green wisdom that surrounded them. Plants respond to intention, she explained, showing River how to touch leaves with respect, how to water roots rather than just soil, how to sense when a plant needed space or companionship. The afternoon River discovered the ecosystem, living beneath the sprawling squash plants, changed something fundamental in their understanding. Lifting the broad leaves revealed a hidden world of pillbugs and earthworms, tiny seedlings that had sprouted from fallen seeds, moisture and darkness creating conditions for life that most people never noticed. It's like a whole secret neighborhood under there, River whispered, carefully replacing the protective canopy of leaves. All these things happening that nobody sees. Nana Rose knelt beside them, her eyes bright with recognition. That's how most important things work, little one. The root's the foundation, the quiet transformation that makes everything else possible. Most people only notice the flowers, but you're learning to see the whole system. As summer deepened, River began applying these garden lessons to the world beyond the fence. At school, they noticed classmates differently, seeing past surface behaviors to the hidden ecosystems of feeling that lived beneath. The boy who acted out during math class carried worry about his parents' arguments the way plants carried water, essential but invisible. The girl who seemed perfect and untouchable moved through her days like a flower that had learned to bloom despite poor soil. Beautiful but possibly struggling, River didn't try to fix or change anyone, just as they had learned not to force plants to grow faster than their natural rhythm. Instead, they offered the same patient presence they brought to the garden, sitting quietly with classmates who needed space, sharing lunch with those who seemed hungry for more than food, understanding that every person, like every plant, had their own season and their own way of reaching toward light. One evening, as late summer painted the sky in shades of apricot and rose, Mrs. Chen brought night-blooming jasmine to plant along the garden's edge. Some flowers only open in darkness, she explained, her voice soft with mystery. They teach us that not all beauty belongs to the daylight hours. River helped dig the holes, their small hands working alongside Mrs. Chen's experienced ones, both of them understanding that they were planting more than flowers. As twilight deepened, and the first tight buds began to loosen into pale stars that breathed impossible sweetness into the cooling air, River felt something shift in their chest, a recognition that some of life's most profound gifts required patience, darkness, and the willingness to wait for the right moment to reveal themselves. The garden settled into its evening rhythm, and River sat between Nana Rose and Mrs. Chen on the weathered bench, breathing jasmine-scented air and listening to the quiet symphony of crickets and distant waves. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new opportunities to practice the art of seeing wholeness in a world that often insisted on choosing sides. But tonight, surrounded by the gentle wisdom of growing things and the patient love of women who understood that healing happened in seasons, not moments, River felt perfectly held by the mystery of becoming, knowing that every ending was also a beginning. Every shadow also a promise of light. The moon above cast its ancient shadows, sometimes one, sometimes two, always teaching the same quiet lesson to anyone willing to learn that wholeness included everything, rejected nothing, and found beauty in the complete spectrum of existence. The jasmine's midnight lesson lingered in River's hair, like a whispered secret as they walked to school 3 days later, carrying the garden's wisdom into the bustling world beyond Nana Rose's fence. Millhaven Elementary smelled of pencil shavings and sea salt blown through propped windows, and River took their usual seat near the glass where harbor light could dance across morning lessons and clouds could drift through arithmetic like gentle interruptions. That was the morning Sage arrived, a child whose presence filled the classroom like weather, deciding what to become. They moved with the restless energy of someone carrying internal storms, their eyes shifting between bright curiosity and guarded distance as the teacher introduced them to faces that stared with the frank assessment children use when measuring newcomers against their established social geography. When asked to share something about themselves, Sage shrugged and spoke their name barely above a whisper, then folded into a silence so complete it seemed to make the room's ordinary sounds more noticeable. River watched from their window seat, noticing how Sage's fingers tapped a steady rhythm against their desk, like someone keeping time with thunder only they could hear. At recess, while other children scattered across the playground in familiar clusters, Sage drifted toward the edge where the schoolyard met the wild meadow, settling beneath the old oak tree with a collection of smooth stones they arranged in careful patterns. River approached slowly, recognizing something in Sage's concentrated stillness that reminded them of their own garden observations. The way important discoveries often happened in quiet spaces, away from noise and hurry. "They're listening to something," River said softly, settling cross-legged beside the stone mandala without disturbing its geometry. Sage looked up, eyes wary but curious. "The rocks know when storms are coming," they replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting simple truth. "They can feel the pressure changing before the clouds even decide to gather." River felt recognition bloom in their chest. The same feeling they experienced watching Nana Rose's compost transform kitchen scraps into rich soil. Here was someone who understood that apparent opposites were often partners, that the natural world spoke in languages most people had forgotten how to hear. Over the following weeks, River and Sage developed a friendship that followed the emotional seasons Sage seemed to embody. Some days, Sage arrived bright and effervescent, their energy infectious as they shared discoveries about bird migrations or the secret patterns in tree bark. Other days, they moved through the halls like someone carrying invisible weight, their usual chatter replaced by thoughtful silence that River learned not to interrupt, but simply accompany. Their favorite meeting place became the harbor at the end of River's Street, where fishing boats returned each evening with their holds full of the day's mixed blessings. They would sit on the weathered dock, legs dangling over water that reflected sky in constantly shifting patterns, watching Captain Morrison and the other fishermen navigate the narrow channel between protective jetties. "Look at that," Sage said one grey afternoon, pointing to a boat heavy with both fish and seaweed, its nets draped with kelp and trailing pieces of driftwood. "Captain Morrison doesn't sort through his catch until he gets to shore. He brings back everything the ocean gave him, the wanted and the unwanted together." River nodded, understanding the lesson their friend was offering. "Like how storms bring rain and wind as partners. You can't have one without the other." "Exactly," Sage replied, their voice soft with the satisfaction of being understood. "My mom keeps telling me I need to control my feelings, to be more even all the time. But feelings aren't supposed to be controlled. They're supposed to be experienced, like weather." They sat in comfortable silence, watching seagulls dive for scraps while the harbor settled into its evening rhythm. River felt grateful for this friendship that required no pretending, no performance of being different than they were. With Sage, they could simply exist in whatever state felt true, knowing their friend understood the natural ebb and flow of human experience. As autumn deepened and the harbor took on the silver-grey tones of shorter days, River began learning to read the subtle signs that preceded Sage's emotional weather changes. A certain stillness in their posture meant a storm was building. Rapid, excited speech often preceded periods of creative intensity. The way they touched objects with unusual gentleness indicated they were moving into one of their tender phases when the world felt too sharp and they needed extra softness. River learned to adjust their own presence accordingly, not to manage Sage's emotions, but to offer appropriate companionship for whatever season their friend was experiencing. During Sage's winter moods, River brought warm silence and patient presence. During their spring phases, River matched their enthusiasm for small discoveries and shared wonder at the world's endless capacity for surprise. One November afternoon, as they watched fishing boats navigate choppy water beneath a sky heavy with unshed rain, Sage turned to River with eyes that held both gratitude and recognition. "You don't try to change me," they said simply. "Everyone else wants me to be different, but you just let me be all the things I am." River smiled, thinking of Nana Rose's garden, where every plant was allowed its own season, its own way of reaching toward light. "That's what friends do," they replied. "They see the whole person, not just the parts that are easy." The first drops of rain began to fall, and instead of running for shelter, both children tilted their faces toward the sky, understanding that storms, like friendships, brought exactly what was needed, even when it didn't look like what anyone had ordered. The harbor accepted the rain with the same grace it accepted everything else, holding both the precious catch and the discarded seaweed in its boundless embrace, teaching them that true friendship meant welcoming the complete weather of another person's heart. Tomorrow would bring new lessons in the art of holding everything with equal tenderness, but tonight they had found in each other the rare gift of being seen completely and loved not, despite their complexities, but because of them. The rain that had blessed their harbor conversation lingered in River's memory like a gentle teacher, and when the next afternoon brought grey skies and the kind of soft drizzle that made indoor spaces feel like sanctuaries, River found themselves drawn toward Millhaven's small public library. They had passed the brick building countless times, nestled between the bakery that perfumed morning air with cinnamon and the old movie theater that showed films from decades past. But today something different called to them from beyond its tall windows. Inside, the air carried the layered scents of aged paper, cedar polish, and that indefinable fragrance of stories waiting to be discovered. The radiators hummed their gentle conversation with the settling walls, and amber light from table lamps created pools of warmth against the grey afternoon. River paused just inside the entrance. Not with their ears alone, but with that deeper attention Nana Rose had taught them in the garden. Noticing how the space held different kinds of silence woven together like a complex tapestry. The librarian looked up from a cart of books they were shelving with obvious care, and River immediately understood they were in the presence of someone who treated stories as living things, deserving respect. Max Holloway had hair the color of winter wheat streaked with silver, eyes that seemed to hold entire weather systems without judgment, and hands that moved with the practiced gentleness of someone who had spent decades tending fragile things. "You must be River," they said, their voice arriving like an invitation to breathe more slowly. "Sage mentioned you might find your way here eventually. Children who understand that friendship includes all weather usually appreciate stories that don't promise only sunshine." River felt immediately welcomed, not just into the library, but into some larger community of people who recognized that life's most profound truths often wore complicated clothing. They watched Max Holloway place a slim volume about unexpected loss next to a collection of poems about finding beauty in ordinary moments, understanding that this wasn't random arrangement, but intentional wisdom, a way of showing how different aspects of experience belong together rather than in separate, competing categories. "These are the books that got returned too quickly," Max Holloway explained, gesturing towards several shelves in a quiet corner where natural light filtered through tall windows. Small handwritten signs marked sections. Stories that ask more, books for brave hearts, tales that include everything. People start reading them and find they're not quite what they expected. Too sad, too complex, too honest about how life actually feels, so they come back here, waiting for readers who are ready for the whole story. River approached these forgotten shelves with the same reverence they brought to Nana Rose's compost pile, sensing that important wisdom often lived in places others preferred to avoid. The books here had covers softened by handling, titles that hinted at emotional territories most people hurried past. "The Weight of Necessary Sadness," "Why Courage Trembles," "Letters to the Parts of Ourselves We've Abandoned." One volume drew River's attention immediately, a collection of folk tales rebound in deep blue cloth with silver lettering that seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. Inside were stories River recognized, but had never heard complete. Tales where the rescued princess carried scars from her experience, where the wise fool offered profound truths wrapped in apparent nonsense, where magical helpers demanded honest payment for their services. These weren't the sanitized versions from childhood, but older, more complete tellings that included the difficult parts editors had often removed. "Those stories remember what we've forgotten," Maxon Holloway said, settling into a worn armchair beside River's reading spot. "That wisdom comes from integrating experience, not avoiding it. That the most powerful transformations happen when we stop pretending life should be simpler than it is." River spent the afternoon absorbed in these rediscovered stories, letting them settle into their understanding like rain, soaking into thirsty earth. Each tale validated something they had intuited but never seen reflected. That strength included gentleness, that healing happened not through forgetting, but through finding meaning, that the most important journeys often led not to destinations, but to deeper ways of seeing. When Sage arrived at school the next morning, carrying one of their internal storms, River didn't try to brighten their friend's mood or offer quick solutions. Instead, they remembered a passage from The Gentle Art of Being Unsure About the Quiet Strength, found in simply acknowledging what was present, rather than rushing toward what might be preferred. "It's okay to feel tangled up," River said softly, offering half their lunch. "Sometimes feelings are like weather systems. They need time to move through, and trying to push them away just makes them stronger." Sage looked up with surprise that softened into recognition, understanding they were being seen without judgment, accepted in whatever state they carried. "You sound like you've been reading different books," they said with a small smile. "I found a place where they keep the stories that include everything," River replied. "Want to see?" That afternoon they walked to the library together, and Meeks Holloway greeted them both like returning travelers. "Every weather is welcome here," they told Sage. "Even thunder has wisdom, if you listen from the right distance." As grey afternoon, light slanted through the tall windows, and the radiators continued. their gentle conversation with the settling building. River understood they had discovered more than books in this quiet corner. They had found a training ground for the kind of emotional literacy the world desperately needed, a place where people could practice holding multiple truths simultaneously, where they could learn that wholeness required not perfection, but integration, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of grace. The winter that followed their library discoveries wrapped Millhaven in the kind of contemplative quiet that invited deeper listening. River found themselves moving through shorter days with a growing sense of anticipation, not the restless energy of waiting for something to happen, but the patient awareness of someone who could feel the slow turn of seasons preparing for revelation. The radiators in their house hummed gentle conversations with the settling walls, and frost painted the windows with delicate ferns that dissolved each morning into tears of recognition. In Nana Rose's garden, now dormant beneath a blanket of mulch and fallen leaves, the night-blooming jasmine waited in patient faith, its roots holding memories of midnight sweetness while snow covered its careful dreams. River learned to read this winter landscape not as absence, but as gestation, understanding that the most profound transformations often happened in darkness, in the quiet spaces where growth gathered strength before revealing itself to light. Sage continued to arrive at school, carrying their internal weather systems, and River found their own capacity for companionship deepening with each passing week. They could sit with their friends' stormy moods without needing to offer sunshine, hold space for Sage's bright enthusiasms without needing to match their intensity, understanding that true friendship meant creating room for the complete emotional landscape another person carried. As spring arrived and then deepened into summer, River felt something shifting within themselves, like a door that had always been there beginning to loosen on hinges that had never quite settled into their final position. The sensation wasn't uncomfortable, more like the feeling of a puzzle piece finally finding its proper place, or a song discovering its missing harmony. Their 13th birthday arrived on a night when the air itself seemed to hold its breath with gentle expectation. Sarah had prepared River's favorite dinner, clam chowder rich with cream and stories of the sea, served with crusty bread that captured ocean salt in every bite. The celebration felt perfect in its simplicity, surrounded by the people who understood that birthdays marked not just the passage of time but the deepening of wisdom, the accumulation of moments that taught the heart how to hold more complexity with greater tenderness. Nana Rose had mentioned, almost casually, that tonight would bring the same rare celestial alignment that had graced River's birth, a phenomenon so infrequent it felt less like astronomy and more like appointment. As evening settled over their small coastal town and the lighthouse began its eternal vigil, River stepped onto the front porch to breathe the salt-sweet air and offer gratitude for this particular life, this specific collection of loves and lessons. Above them, the moon hung full and luminous, and as River watched with the patient attention Nana Rose had taught them in the garden, something extraordinary began to unfold. The familiar single shadow at their feet began to shimmer and separate, like light refracting through water, until two distinct silhouettes lay on the weathered porch boards. But this time, River could perceive the difference, not just with their eyes but with some deeper faculty that had been developing throughout their 13 years of learning, to see wholeness in a world that preferred fragments. One shadow appeared as it always had, dark and solid, grounded in the physical reality of body and moonlight. Its companion carried an almost luminous quality, as if it were composed of gathered starlight rather than blocked illumination. The realization arrived not as dramatic revelation, but as gentle recognition, like finally understanding a song they had been humming unconsciously for years. River could perceive with crystalline clarity the dual nature of everything around them. The house held both the warmth of home and the tender ache of their father's absence. The ocean carried both life-giving abundance and the dangerous power that had claimed him. Even their own heart contained both the joy of being deeply loved and the sweet sadness of knowing that all love existed within the larger context of impermanence. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by this expanded perception, River felt profoundly comforted. It was like being given permission to acknowledge what they had always known, but had never been encouraged to name, that nothing was ever purely one thing, that wholeness required the integration of apparent opposites, that the most beautiful truths often wore paradoxical clothing. Nana Rose appeared beside them on the porch, moving with the quiet awareness of someone who had been expecting this moment. Her weathered hand found River's shoulder, and in that gentle touch River felt decades of similar recognitions, countless moments when the veil between ordinary perception and deeper understanding had grown thin enough to see through. "It's beginning," she said softly, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a gardener watching long-planted seeds finally push through soil toward light. "You're learning to see with both eyes at once, the one that notices what's visible and the one that perceives what's true." River turned to look at their grandmother, and now they could see her completely. The Nana Rose who had spent decades cultivating wisdom in her garden, and the young woman who had once stood on this same porch waiting for news of ships that sometimes didn't return. The elder who offered comfort to neighbors in their darkest hours, and the person who still carried her own unhealed places with grace and dignity. "It doesn't hurt," River said with wonder, understanding that this expanded perception came not as burden but as gift. "I thought seeing everything would be too much, but it's like finally being able to breathe properly." "That's because you're seeing what was always there," Nana Rose replied, her eyes reflecting moonlight like tide pools holding starshine. "Most people learn to look away from the difficult parts, but that just makes them carry the weight unconsciously. When you can see the whole picture, you understand that everything belongs, everything has its place in the larger pattern. Some people are born to be bridges, River, born to help others see that they don't have to choose between light and shadow, joy and sorrow, strength and tenderness. Above them, the moon continued its ancient teaching, casting shadows that reminded anyone willing to learn that truth was never singular. That wisdom required the integration of all experience, and that the most profound peace came not from avoiding life's complexity, but from learning to hold it all with patient, endless love. The morning after River's awakening brought the kind of gentle light that seemed to illuminate not just surfaces, but the tender spaces between things, and they moved through their familiar routines with the quiet wonder of someone seeing their world through newly clarified vision. Steam rising from Sarah's morning tea carried both warmth and the promise of eventual cooling, while the kitchen table bore the accumulated stories of countless meals shared and conversations that had shaped their small family into something resilient and whole. At school, River found themselves moving through hallways with a different quality of attention, no longer just observing their classmates, but perceiving the complete emotional landscapes each person carried, like invisible weather systems. Jenny Morrison, who always seemed so confident with her perfectly arranged notebooks and circle of admirers, moved through her day carrying a subtle tension in her shoulders that spoke of pressure to maintain an image that never quite felt authentic. Marcus Webb, often dismissed as the class clown, used humor the way plants used leaves, creating a protective canopy that filtered harsh light while allowing nourishment to reach the tender places underneath. During art class, River noticed how Ms. Dwyer smiled with practiced brightness that didn't quite reach her eyes, paint smudges on her sleeve like small constellations, marking her as someone who understood the necessity of creative mess. When River lingered after class to help wash brushes, they didn't ask questions about the grief they could sense hovering around their teacher like morning fog. Instead, they simply said, "I like how you let us make messes and still call them experiments." Ms. Dwyer's shoulders softened a fraction, and River understood they had offered exactly the kind of recognition she needed. "Thank you, River," she whispered, rinsing cobalt blue until the water ran clear. Sometimes the most important discoveries happen when we stop trying to control the outcome. The real transformation began when River discovered the Millhaven Community Center, a warm brick building nestled between the bakery and the old movie theater, where the town's various threads intersected in a tapestry of shared life. Mr. Ortiz, who ran the center with a kind smile and pockets perpetually full of peppermints, welcomed River like a neighbor he had always known was coming. "You don't have to do much," he explained, showing River where the mugs were kept and how to work the ancient but reliable coffee maker. "Sometimes people just need a corner to sit where no one asks them to be cheerful. If you're willing, keep the kettle full and the chairs steady. That's often enough." River understood immediately that they had found their training ground, a place where they could practice the art of holding space for whatever emotional weather people brought through the doors. They began spending afternoons there, not as an official volunteer but as a quiet presence, someone who could offer tea and patient attention without trying to fix or change anything. The first person to truly test River's developing gift was Mrs. Rodriguez, a woman whose smile could warm the coldest day, but whose eyes held the accumulated weight of many burdens. She ran the center's evening programs with tireless dedication, but River could see how she carried worry about her grown son like a stone in her chest, heavy and constant. One grey afternoon, when rain drummed against the windows and the center felt particularly cozy, Mrs. Rodriguez sat beside River and spoke quietly about her fears. "He's caught in something I can't help him escape," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I watch him struggle and feel so helpless." River didn't offer advice or empty reassurances. Instead, they simply sat with Mrs. Rodriguez in her pain, seeing not just her anguish but the fierce, enduring love that was its inseparable companion. In that shared silence, Mrs. Rodriguez found something she hadn't expected: permission to hold both her sorrow and her love without having to choose between them. "You have a way of just being," she said finally, her voice soft with gratitude. "You don't try to solve things, but somehow just by being there, you make them feel a little lighter to carry." River thought of Nana Rose's compost pile, how it didn't try to change the scraps but simply held them, allowing transformation to happen in its own time. They thought of the night-blooming jasmine, opening its beauty to darkness not despite it, but because of it, understanding that some gifts required the right conditions to reveal themselves. As weeks passed, River became known as someone who never judged, never pushed, never tried to rush another person's natural process. When Old Man Hemlock stormed in one blustery afternoon, railing against new fishing regulations that threatened his livelihood, most people instinctively tried to calm him down or change the subject. River simply listened, seeing beneath his anger the deep fear of losing a way of life, the pride in his craft, the unspoken worry for his family's future. When Hemlock finally ran out of breath, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, River quietly offered him tea. "It's a lot to carry, isn't it?" they said gently. The old fisherman looked at River with eyes that softened like tide pools warming an afternoon sun. "Aye, child," he said, accepting the cup. "More than most know." In that moment of being truly seen, some of his tension finally found release. River was learning that their gift wasn't magic in the way of spells or supernatural powers, but something far more profound: the ability to create space where people could be completely themselves, without fear of judgment or the pressure to be different. They were becoming what Nana Rose had recognized from the beginning: a bridge between what others perceived as opposing forces, a living reminder that wholeness included everything and rejected nothing. Walking home through Millhaven's familiar streets as evening painted the harbor silver, River felt the deep satisfaction of someone discovering how to use a gift that had always been theirs, but never fully understood. The expanded perception wasn't burden but opportunity, a way of moving through the world that honored the complete emotional reality every person carried, while offering exactly the kind of presence each situation required. At the harbor, they paused to watch fishing boats prepare for their evening departure, understanding now that their gift was like those vessels, designed not to stay safely in port, but to navigate the deeper waters where the most nourishing catch could be found. The lighthouse began its eternal vigil, sending its beam across waters that held both treasures and dangers in equal measure, teaching the same lesson River was learning to embody. That true service meant illuminating what was actually there, not what people hoped to find, and that sometimes the greatest gift was simply the willingness to see and hold it all with endless, patient love. The lighthouse's evening beam swept across waters that carried both promise and uncertainty, and River felt its rhythm settle into their bones like a trusted heartbeat as they walked home from another afternoon at the community center. The gift they were learning to embody felt less like possession and more like participation, a way of joining the world's natural tendency toward healing when given the right conditions and patient attention. It was during the first week of autumn's deeper settling, when harbor mist clung to morning windows and the air carried hints of wood smoke and approaching winter, that River noticed Sage's weather beginning to shift. The signs arrived subtly, the way a coastline learns about storms through changes in gulf light patterns and the pressure behind one's eyes. Sage's shoulders climbed slightly higher toward their ears. Their laughter arrived thin and quickly vanished, and their careful stone patterns beneath the oak tree became more intricate before stopping altogether. At school, Sage started avoiding their usual window seat, choosing instead the far corner, where fluorescent light flattened everything into sameness. When Ms. Dwyer praised their charcoal drawing, Sage shrugged as if praise were a coat grown 2 sizes too small. River felt the familiar urge to make it better rise and pass through them, like a wave that crested and dissolved on purpose. Remembering the compost pile, the night-blooming jasmine, Mr. Ortiz's simple instruction about keeping kettles full and chairs steady, instead of trying to pierce Sage's defenses or coax them from their withdrawal. River began to show up in small, consistent ways. After school, they walked by Sage's house without announcing their arrival, taking a seat on the front steps like someone willing to share weather rather than change it. The porch smelled faintly of raincoats and cedar, and when Sage opened the door just long enough to say, "I don't want company," River simply nodded and stayed a while longer, tracing the grain of weathered boards before leaving a smooth stone on the doormat, one that looked like a crescent moon. The next day, River returned, not to insist but to be a reliable shoreline. When Sage didn't open the door, River placed a sprig of jasmine in a small jar of water where the breeze could carry its scent inside if the window happened to be open. The day after that brought a library card tucked in an envelope with a handwritten note. "If words feel easier than talking, I can read." No pressure, no deadline, just the kind of invitation that held as steady as lighthouse beams. At the community center, Mr. Ortiz noticed River's quiet preoccupation and offered gentle wisdom while they folded metal chairs after an evening meeting. "Sometimes storms anchor to something," he said, handing River 2 peppermint candies. "Change at home, fear about the future, even shifts in how the body holds the day. Folks need room to be messy about it without making a mess of each other. Presence is a kind of shelter, but remember, shelter doesn't chase the storm. It waits with the door unlatched." River learned through careful observation that Sage's family was navigating their own complex weather. Pieces reached them the way rain finds seams, a father taking longer work trips, temporary crowding at Sage's aunt's apartment while repairs were made at home, a grandmother's health rattling like windows in March wind. Not dramatic or catastrophic, just a lot arriving all at once, like waves coming closer together than usual. On a Thursday that smelled of metal and approaching rain, Sage finally spoke through their door. "I'm not mad at you," they said, voice muffled but clear. "I just don't have room for anyone right now." River nodded, knowing their friend might not see the gesture. "I can be very small," they replied. "Smaller than your worry. I'll take up only as much space as a teacup." The latch clicked, then clicked again. No door opened, yet something had shifted the way a line of kelp marks a new high tide. That weekend, River brought a thermos of chamomile and honey, pouring 1 cup for the top step and keeping their own on the bottom. Minutes passed before the soft scrape of porcelain moving. Then the cup reappeared empty, with words hooked to its handle. "It feels like I'm too much," Sage said, voice lowered by shadows. "Like I'm a storm warning people don't want to read." River let the words settle unhurried. "You are weather," they said finally. "Weather is allowed. I like being outside." From behind the door came the smallest laugh, the kind dew makes when it meets a leaf at dawn, the pattern held for days. River arrived with small offerings the way the sea leaves driftwood at the town's edge. A pressed leaf, shaped like a heart with a missing corner. A copied page from one of Memex Holloway's books about courage that trembles and still proceeds. A card with weather boxes and the line, "Today's forecast is welcome." The next afternoon, River found it returned with 5 check marks crowded into the rain box and "maybe" written beside stars. One rain-polished evening, Sage stepped outside at last. They didn't sit exactly close, but closeness isn't always measured in inches. They watched streetlight carve golden cones from mist, while River waited with the patience of someone who understood that healing happened in seasons, not moments. "Sometimes I want to be empty," Sage said eventually. "Other times I want to be so full the world can't ignore me." River breathed with them in shared cadence. "Both are honest," they replied. "Some days the ocean pulls back so far you can see hidden rocks. Some days it throws itself on shore like it can't help loving the land." Sage leaned against the railing, and River noticed the tremor that had lived in their hands was quieter. "If I tell the truth, will you carry it?" River thought of the compost breathing under frost, jasmine petals opening in darkness, the kettle kept perpetually full. "I can hold it beside you," they said. "That way neither of us has to lift more than we can." Words arrived in pieces after that, carried on tides that didn't want to overwhelm the beach. How loud it was at their aunt's place. How quiet nights felt without familiar creaks. How schoolwork stacked like unwashed dishes. How sleep sometimes failed to knit things back together. River didn't suggest systems or solutions. They received each piece like smooth stones, turning them palm to palm until warmth spread back into both their hands. The next day, beneath their oak tree, Sage carefully arranged stones again, not into the strict mandalas of before, but into small constellations with room between them, space for air and drift and light. When the bell rang, Sage flicked a pebble with their finger and glanced at River sideways, the way they did when closeness felt almost too bright to look at directly. "The rocks don't mind storms, you know," they murmured. They turned rounder. River smiled, feeling truth click into place like a clasp. "And smoother to hold," they agreed. As the season softened toward winter's deeper contemplation, River sensed new currents beneath everything, an invitation to shape what they had been practicing into something that could travel further than porches or playgrounds. The library's quiet corner waited like tilled soil. And River began to understand that stories might be another way to keep the kettle warm, a place where people could set down their weather and find it welcomed into a larger, more accepting sky. The sense of new currents beneath everything guided River back to the library the next morning, where frost had painted the tall windows with delicate ferns that caught early light like captured prayers. The building seemed to breathe with quiet anticipation, its radiators humming soft conversations, with walls that had witnessed countless stories seeking their proper homes. River found Max Holloway arranging returned books with the careful attention of someone tending a garden, where every plant had its season and purpose. "I keep thinking about those forgotten books," River said, settling into the worn armchair beside MX Holloway's desk. "The ones that came back too quickly because they held too much truth. What if we made them into something people could find when they're ready?" Max Holloway's eyes brightened with the recognition of someone who had been waiting for exactly this conversation. "I've been wondering the same thing," they replied, their voice carrying the warmth of shared understanding. "People need stories that don't ask them to be different than they are. Stories that show them how to hold everything, the difficult and the beautiful together. Together, they began what would become known simply as the Healing Stories section, though no official sign ever marked it as such. They gathered books from the forgotten shelves and arranged them with the same intuitive wisdom Nana Rose brought to her garden, not by subject or author, but by the emotional weather they could shelter. Stories about finding strength in uncertainty sat beside tales of love that included loss, memoirs of resilience nested near poetry that honored the full spectrum of human feeling. River created small, handwritten cards to slip between pages, for when your heart feels too big for your chest, and when you need permission to be complicated, and stories that understand storms pass but leave gifts. The cards appeared where they were needed most, as if drawn by the same magnetic pull that brought the right people to the right books at exactly the right moment. The first person to discover the new arrangement was Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman from Elm Street whose sharp words had always masked deep loneliness. She approached the shelves with the cautious curiosity of someone who had learned not to expect understanding from the world. River watched from their reading spot as she lifted a slim volume about the unexpected friendships that bloom in life's winter seasons. "I didn't know they made books about this," Mrs. Patterson whispered. More to herself than to anyone else, she settled into a nearby chair, and River noticed how her shoulders gradually relaxed as she read, like ice beginning to thaw in spring sunlight. When she left that afternoon, she carried the book carefully as if it contained something precious and fragile. Sage arrived after school, bringing their own weather of quiet determination. They had been different since their storm season, not diminished but refined like sea glass tumbled smooth by waves. "I want to help," they said simply, and River understood that their friend had found their own way of giving back to the community that had held them through difficult tides. Sage proved to have an intuitive gift for matching people with stories. They would sit quietly in the children's section, reading aloud to small groups who gathered like birds finding shelter. Their voice had learned to carry both strength and gentleness, and the stories they chose always seemed to address whatever unspoken needs their young listeners carried. A tale about a tree that grew crooked, but still provided the perfect shade. A story of rain that was sad to leave the clouds, but discovered joy in helping flowers grow. One grey afternoon, when harbour mist pressed against the library windows like a gentle embrace, a young father arrived carrying the exhausted bewilderment of someone trying to be everything to everyone. His toddler had been crying for hours, and he moved through the stacks with the desperate hope of someone seeking any kind of relief. River didn't approach directly, but simply ensured a comfortable chair appeared in his path, along with a picture book about a lighthouse that learned its beam was most helpful when it shone steadily rather than trying to illuminate everything at once. The man read to his child in a voice that gradually found its natural rhythm, and both father and daughter settled into the story's gentle wisdom about doing one thing well rather than many things poorly. Mex. Holloway began leaving a notebook near the reading area, labeled simply "For the Next Traveler." People filled it with lines that became lifelines for others. The sadness doesn't mean you're broken, and courage can be quiet, and some days, just breathing is enough. The notebook filled and was replaced, then filled again, creating an ongoing conversation between strangers who understood each other's struggles without ever meeting. As autumn deepened toward winter's contemplative quiet, River found themselves writing their own stories, small tales that grew from their daily observations of how healing happened in ordinary moments. They wrote about a harbor that accepted both treasure and debris, understanding that the sea's gifts came mixed together. About a garden where compost became soil, where endings fed beginnings in endless, generous cycles. These stories found their way onto the community center's clipboard, tucked into library books, shared in quiet conversations that created ripples of understanding throughout Millhaven. River never signed them, preferring to let the words do their work without claiming credit, understanding that the most powerful healing often happened anonymously, like rain that fell without announcing itself, but nourished everything it touched. One evening, as River prepared to leave the library, they paused at the window where harbor lights painted golden reflections on the glass. In that doubled image, the warm interior behind them and the vast night ahead, they saw their own future taking shape. The stories they were helping to gather and share were creating something larger than individual healing. They were weaving a net strong enough to hold their entire community's emotional weather, spacious enough to welcome every kind of human experience. Sage appeared beside them, both friends comfortable in shared silence as they watched fishing boats return with their evening catch. "We're making something good, aren't we?" Sage said softly. River nodded, feeling the deep satisfaction of someone discovering how individual gifts could serve collective healing. Tomorrow would bring new stories, new opportunities to create space where truth could be safely held. But tonight, surrounded by books that understood the full spectrum of human experience and friends who had learned to weather all seasons together, River felt perfectly aligned with their purpose, not as someone who fixed broken things, but as someone who helped others see that nothing was ever truly broken, only waiting to be understood and welcomed home. The golden reflections in the library window seemed to carry forward into the weeks that followed. As winter settled over Millhaven, with the kind of gentle authority that asked the town to speak in softer tones and move with more deliberate grace, River found themselves walking between the library, community center, and home with a growing sense of purpose that felt less like ambition and more like a river finding its natural course. Toward the sea, the Healing Stories section continued to draw visitors who arrived carrying various kinds of weather in their hearts, and River learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when someone was ready for a particular tale. Mrs. Patterson returned weekly now, her sharp edges gradually softening as she discovered stories that validated her complexity rather than asking her to be simpler. The young father with the crying toddler had become a regular, often reading aloud to small groups of parents who gathered in the children's section, their voices creating a gentle chorus of understanding. It was during one of these quiet library afternoons, when snow pressed against the tall windows like a soft grey blanket, that River first noticed the change in Nana Rose. She had arrived for their usual weekly visit to the Healing Stories section, But her steps carried a different quality, lighter somehow, as if she were learning to walk on air rather than solid ground. Her eyes held the same warm wisdom they always had, but now they seemed to gaze through the immediate present towards something vast and patient that waited just beyond the horizon. "I've been thinking about seasons," Nana Rose said, settling into the worn armchair, with the careful attention of someone learning to conserve energy for what mattered most. "How the garden teaches us that endings are just another kind of beginning. That what looks like death is often transformation wearing unfamiliar clothes." River felt recognition bloom in their chest, not alarm, but a deep, quiet understanding that their grandmother was beginning her own gentle transition, moving with the same natural grace she had always brought to tending growing things. They didn't try to deny what they sensed or fill the moment with false cheerfulness. Instead, they simply moved their chair closer and asked, "What does the garden want us to know about this season?" The conversation that followed became the template for many that would come, unhurried exchanges that honored both the approaching change and the precious present moment. Nana Rose spoke about the compost pile's patient work through winter, how it continued its essential transformation even when covered by snow, how the most important processes often happened in darkness and quiet. At the community center, River began to notice how their own approach was deepening. When Dr. Martinez arrived one evening, carrying the exhausted bewilderment of someone trying to heal suffering that went beyond what medicine could touch, River didn't offer solutions, but created space for the questions that needed to be asked. The conversation that emerged drew other healthcare workers, teachers, and caregivers who had been carrying similar struggles in isolation. "Sometimes I think we've forgotten that healing doesn't always mean fixing," Dr. Martinez said, her voice soft with the vulnerability of someone speaking a truth they had been afraid to name. "Some of my patients are teaching me that courage can look like accepting help. That strength sometimes means admitting we don't have all the answers." River felt the familiar stirring of recognition, understanding that this moment had been waiting for them like a tide pool at exactly the right depth. "Maybe healing means learning to hold pain and hope at the same time," they said gently, thinking of Nana Rose's garden where death fed life in endless, generous cycles, finding ways to let both be true without having to choose between them. The gathering that followed lasted until the center's old radiators had settled into their deepest night rhythm, and from it grew what would become known as the Circle of Both Waters, though no one remembered who first used the phrase. It wasn't a formal program, but a monthly space where people could bring their complete experiences, the light and shadow together, and find them welcomed into a larger story that made room for everything. Sage, now moving through their teenage years, with the hard-won wisdom of someone who had learned to weather their own emotional storms, became River's closest collaborator in this expanding work. They had developed their own gift for creating safety through gentle honesty, never pretending that difficult feelings weren't real, but helping others understand that emotions, like weather, moved through in their own time. "You taught me something important," Sage told River one afternoon as they walked the harbor path where their friendship had first taken root, "that I don't have to choose between being the person who struggles and the person who helps others. I can carry sadness and joy in the same heart, fear and courage in the same breath." As winter deepened and then began its slow retreat toward spring, River found themselves moving between their expanding community work and the intimate rhythms of home, where Nana Rose's gentle transition continued with the same natural grace she had always brought to seasonal changes. They learned to read the subtle signs of her body's wisdom, understanding when she needed quiet companionship and when she preferred to rest in solitude, when she wanted to hear stories and when she simply wanted to watch dust motes dance in afternoon sunlight. The house became a quiet sanctuary where neighbors arrived carrying their own weather and left feeling steadier, as if the lighthouse inside them had been reminded of its work. Mrs. Chen brought soup and the kind of listening that didn't stop at words. Mr. Ortiz fixed the sticky back door, then left 2 peppermints on the windowsill like tiny guardians. Even Old Man Hemlock, whose anger about fishing regulations had once filled the community center with storm energy, began stopping by with bundles of cedar from his woodpile, understanding that some gifts were too important for words. One evening, as River prepared tea for their grandmother and themselves, They realized that everything they had been learning about holding space for others' complete emotional reality was now being called upon within their own family. Sarah struggled with Nana Rose's decline, her fierce love manifesting as a quiet desperation to fix what couldn't be fixed. River found themselves offering their mother the same patient presence they brought to the community center, not trying to make her sadness disappear, but simply acknowledging its place in the larger constellation of love. "She's not going anywhere all at once," Nana Rose said one afternoon, humor still alive in her eyes as she watched River arrange fresh jasmine in a small vase. "Just practicing the art of staying present, while learning the art of letting go. They're not opposites, you know. They're partners in the same dance." As the first warm day arrived carrying spring in its breath like a secret, River stood at the harbor's edge, watching fishing boats prepare for their evening work, understanding that they had become part of something much larger than their individual gift. They were helping to weave a net strong enough to hold their community's complete emotional reality, spacious enough to welcome every kind of human weather, resilient enough to support the kind of healing that happened not through avoiding difficulty, but through learning to carry it together with infinite, patient grace. The lighthouse began its nightly vigil, sending its beam across waters that held both treasures and dangers in equal measure, teaching the same lesson River was learning to embody on an ever-expanding scale. That true service meant illuminating what was actually there, not what people hoped to find, and that sometimes the greatest gift was simply the willingness to see and hold it all with endless, patient love. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice this art of holding everything, but tonight, surrounded by the gentle rhythms of a community learning to embrace its own wholeness, River felt perfectly aligned with their purpose, not as someone who fixed broken things, but as someone who helped others see that nothing was ever truly broken, only waiting to be understood and welcomed home. The lighthouse's beam swept across waters that carried messages between shore and horizon, and River found themselves reading these liquid letters with the same intuitive understanding they brought to human hearts. Spring's gentle arrival had awakened something deeper in Millhaven's collective spirit, and the informal gatherings at the community center were evolving into something more intentional, more sacred, though no one would have used such formal language to describe what was happening. The circle of both waters began the way most necessary things did in their small coastal town, with chairs borrowed from storage and a kettle set to steady simmer. River and Sage arranged the room with the same intuitive care Nana Rose brought to her garden, understanding that healing spaces required both intention and organic flow. They placed 2 wide-mouthed jars on a small table at the circle's heart, one filled with harbor water gathered at high tide, the other with rainwater saved from the previous week's gentle storm. Beside them sat bowls of smooth stones and weathered shells, offerings from the sea that had learned patience through tumbling. "You've got the feeling right," Mr. Ortiz said, leaning in the doorway with pockets that rattled softly with peppermints. "Sometimes people just need to see that both can sit on the same table without quarreling." They didn't advertise the gathering, but people arrived as if guided by tide. Mrs. Patterson took a chair close to the door, her sharp edges softened by months of discovering stories that welcomed her complexity. Dr. Martinez came straight from the clinic, hands washed, but eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent the day trying to heal suffering that went beyond what medicine could touch. Ms. Dwyer sat with paint still fresh on her sleeves, the color a small confession of her need to create beauty, even when grief lived in her chest. River opened each evening by placing a stone in one palm and a shell in the other, their voice carrying the same gentle authority they had learned from watching Nana Rose tend growing things. "Tonight we practice holding both," they would say softly. "We don't offer advice unless someone asks. We make room for silence to be a kind of speaking. If you want, you can place a hand on one of the jars when you talk. You're welcome to say nothing at all." The first silence was always awkward, in the way all first silences are, full of polite glances and careful breathing. Then someone would reach toward the rain jar or the harbor water, and words would begin to flow like streams, finding their natural course toward the sea. Ms. Dwyer spoke about teaching students to experiment, while her sister's medical scans showed uncertainty threaded through every image. Old Man Hemlock, surprising everyone, including himself, began attending regularly, his anger about fishing regulations gradually revealing itself as fear dressed in protective clothing. "I spent months talking myself angry," he said one evening, his weathered hands turning a smooth shell like a prayer stone. "Then I realized anger was just the fire I built, so I wouldn't have to admit I'm scared I can't learn a new way to live." River learned to read the rhythm of the room's breath, placing their words in spaces that asked for them rather than forcing conversation. After each person spoke, they would offer gentle reflection without adding weight. "You're carrying fear and love together. You're tired and you still care. You want certainty and you're willing to walk with questions." The E-car room always answered with the sound of many kinds of relief. Between gatherings, River's understanding of their gift continued to deepen through daily encounters with Nana Rose, whose gentle transition taught lessons about holding presence and release as partners rather than opponents. Her body was learning the art of conservation, saving energy for conversations that distilled decades of wisdom into moments that would echo long after her voice joined the larger silence. "The gift you've been given," she said one afternoon as they sat in her garden, where early flowers pushed through, soil still cool from winter's embrace, "isn't just about seeing both sides of things. You create space where transformation can happen safely, where people discover they don't have to carry their burdens alone." River listened with complete attention, understanding their grandmother was offering recognition of purpose that would guide them far beyond this particular season. "But remember," Nana Rose continued, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned when to hold on and when to let go, "the most important person you'll ever learn to hold space for is yourself. The gift only works when it flows through someone who has made peace with their own contradictions." As spring deepened and Sage prepared for their departure to study psychology at the State University, River felt the familiar bittersweet recognition that healthy love required celebrating growth, even when it meant separation. Their friend had been accepted into a program that would help them understand the science behind what they had been practicing intuitively, with plans to return and help their work reach people who needed permission to be completely human. "You'll carry the circle wherever you go," River told Sage during one of their harbor walks, watching fishing boats navigate between protective jetties. "And you'll find new ways to help people see they don't have to choose between their light and shadow." The circle's influence began appearing in subtle transformations throughout Millhaven. People spoke differently about their struggles, no longer viewing difficult emotions as problems requiring immediate solution, but as weather systems that moved through in their own time. The community center became a place where complete emotional honesty was not just tolerated but welcomed, where the phrase "toxic divide" transformed from something to be eliminated into something to be integrated with patience and understanding. River continued writing their gentle stories, now sharing them within the circle itself, tales of moons that cast two shadows without apology, rivers that learned to flow around obstacles through patience rather than force, gardens where compost became soil in endless cycles of generous transformation. These weren't prescriptive narratives, but lullabies for souls learning to embrace their own wholeness. Walking home through familiar streets as evening painted the harbor silver, River felt the deep satisfaction of someone discovering how individual gifts could serve collective healing. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice the art of holding everything with equal tenderness. But tonight, surrounded by the gentle rhythms of a community learning to embrace its own completeness, they understood that their work was becoming something larger than individual healing, a living demonstration that wholeness required not perfection, but integration, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of grace that could hold it all with endless, patient love. The deep satisfaction of serving collective healing carried River through the gentle transition of autumn into winter, as Sage prepared for their departure to study psychology at the Coastal University, 3 hours north of Millhaven. Their parting arrived not as rupture but as tide, natural and temporary, with the understanding that some separations were actually expansions, like breath that needed to be released before it could deepen. The morning Sage left. River walked them to the bus stop, where salt air mixed with exhaust and possibility. They didn't make promises that would strain under distance, or vows that would compete with growth. Instead, Sage pressed a smooth stone into River's palm, still warm from their pocket, while River offered a small jar of harbor water. its contents catching morning light like captured starshine. "Keep me close to your tide," Sage whispered, and River understood they meant not just memory, but the ongoing rhythm of connection that would flow between them regardless of miles. Letters began arriving with the regularity of tides, each one carrying news that felt less like reports and more like continuing conversation. Sage wrote about professors who spoke of integration theory and emotional regulation, their excitement evident in margins crowded with observations. They're putting academic language to what we already know through practice. All these studies about wholeness, and I keep thinking of your two shadows, Nana Rose's compost, the way the circle holds everything without judgment. River replied with stories from Millhaven's evolving landscape. The circle of both waters had grown beyond the community center's capacity, drawing visitors from neighboring towns who arrived carrying their own weather and left feeling permission to be completely human. Mrs. Patterson had begun co-facilitating smaller gatherings, her sharp edges now revealed as protective wisdom that could shelter others learning to embrace their complexity. Dr. Martinez brought medical students to observe, teaching them that healing often began not with diagnosis, but with the simple art of listening to complete stories. Through winter's contemplative months, River felt their own understanding deepening like roots finding richer soil. They learned to hold space for larger groups while maintaining the intimate quality that made transformation possible, discovering that their gift scaled not through force, but through trust, like lighthouse beams that reached further by shining steadier. Nana Rose's gentle transition continued with the same natural grace she brought to seasonal changes, and River found themselves learning the art of holding presence and release as partners rather than opponents. Their grandmother's body conserved energy for conversations that distilled decades of wisdom into moments that would echo long after her voice joined the larger silence. "The gift grows through use," Nana Rose said one grey afternoon as they sat watching harbour ice form delicate sculptures that would melt with tomorrow's sun. "But remember, the most important person you'll ever learn to hold space for is yourself. Integration begins at home." When spring arrived and Sage returned for a brief visit, River felt recognition bloom like jasmine opening to darkness. Their friend had matured not by losing their passionate intensity, but by learning to channel emotional weather with greater purpose. They spoke of academic frameworks that held gently, of professors who understood that the most profound healing happened when people stopped trying to eliminate their difficult parts and learned instead to integrate them with patience and grace. "I want to come home," Sage said during one of their harbor walks, "watching fishing boats navigate between protective jetties. Not because I can't handle distance, but because I understand now what we're building together. The theory makes sense of the practice, and the practice gives life to the theory." River felt deep satisfaction in their friend's recognition, understanding that the most meaningful gifts were often the ones that helped others discover their own capacity for wholeness. "The circle needs both," they replied, thinking of harbor water and rainwater sitting side by side without competition. "Your frameworks and my presence, your questions and my listening, we're like seasons in a single year." That summer, Sage completed their degree and returned to Millhaven with a small suitcase and a cutting from a fig tree someone had gifted them for new beginnings. They found a cottage near the bluff, where harbor wind braided itself with pine, a place with morning light in the kitchen and windows that faced the moon's favorite path. River helped them arrange the guest room first. Clean quilts, tissues tucked in obvious and secret places, a lamp with gentle settings, books that understood the full spectrum of human experience. They painted one room the exact shade of dawn before it admits pink, understanding they were creating not just shelter, but sanctuary. Their partnership evolved with the organic wisdom of tides finding their rhythm. River brought steady presence that allowed truth to unfold safely, while Sage offered frameworks that held experience gently without trapping anyone inside rigid categories. When one grew thin with caring, the other swelled with quiet strength, their differences creating harmony rather than discord. The circle of both waters expanded naturally, meeting in their living room for smaller gatherings while continuing the larger community sessions. People arrived carrying various kinds of weather and left feeling more like themselves, understanding that healing happened not through avoiding difficulty, but through learning to carry it together with infinite patient grace. Walking home through familiar streets as evening painted the harbor silver, River felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had discovered how individual gifts could serve collective healing, while creating the kind of partnership that honored both solitude and togetherness. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice the art of holding everything with equal tenderness, but tonight, surrounded by the gentle rhythms of a community learning to embrace its own wholeness, they felt perfectly aligned with their expanding purpose. The lighthouse began its eternal vigil, sending its beam across waters that held both treasures and mysteries in equal measure, teaching the same lesson River and Sage were learning to embody together: that true service meant illuminating what was actually there, and that sometimes the greatest gift was simply the willingness to see and hold it all with endless, patient love. The lighthouse's eternal vigil continued to sweep across waters that held both treasures and mysteries, and River felt its rhythm settle deeper into their bones as spring brought new currents to their expanding life with Sage. Their cottage on the bluff had developed its own gravitational pull, drawing people who arrived carrying weather they had never learned to name. But increasingly, the visitors who lingered longest were the smallest ones, children who seemed to recognize something in their home that felt like permission to be completely human. The first to stay was Maya, Mrs. Chen's great-niece, who arrived on a Tuesday morning carrying a suitcase held together with duct tape and determination. She was 7 years old with eyes that held too much knowledge and a spirit that had learned to make itself smaller than its natural size. Her parents were navigating their own storm season in the city, where urgent voices spoke of problems that seemed to have no patient solutions. "She needs space to be loud and quiet in the same day," Mrs. Chen explained, her weathered hands gentle on Maya's shoulders. "She asked specifically to stay with the people who understand that feelings don't need fixing." River felt recognition bloom in their chest, not surprise but the deep satisfaction of puzzle pieces finding their proper places. Maya stood in their doorway like a small lighthouse, already knowing her own work but needing safe waters to practice it. Her first question wasn't about rules or schedules, but whether they had books that didn't end with everyone being happy all the time. "We have stories that end with everyone being real," Sage replied, and Maya's shoulders relaxed like sails finding favorable wind. The house rearranged itself around Maya's presence with organic ease, the guest room becoming hers with afternoon light and windows facing the harbor, where fishing boats demonstrated daily lessons about bringing back mixed catches. River and Sage learned to read her emotional weather with the same patient attention they brought to adult storms, understanding that children's feelings moved faster but required the same quality of witnessing. Maya had inherited Mrs. Chen's gift for listening to plants, but her version extended to people and the subtle conversations that happened between raindrops and roof shingles. She could sense when someone at the circle needed extra gentleness, appearing beside them with colored pencils and paper for drawing feelings that didn't fit into words. Her presence transformed their gatherings in ways none of them had anticipated, her natural acceptance of emotional complexity giving adults permission to be as honest as children. Other children began appearing with the same organic inevitability. Finn arrived through the formal fostering process, a quiet boy whose previous home had felt like a perpetual storm. He carried sadness the way River once had, like a stone in his chest, and spent his first weeks watching the harbor with the intensity of someone learning to trust that boats could return safely. One gray afternoon, River found him sitting on the dock, his small frame hunched against the vastness of the sea. "My old home felt like a storm," he whispered, voice barely audible above the gulls. "I thought I left it behind, but sometimes it still catches me." River settled beside him, offering a smooth stone worn gentle by countless tides. "Storms leave their marks," they said softly, "but they also bring things to shore that were hidden beneath the waves. The sadness isn't something wrong with you, Finn. It's like the deep parts of the ocean, sometimes dark, sometimes mysterious, but full of life and teaching us how to appreciate the sunshine even more." Sage joined them, kneeling beside Finn with the kind of presence they had learned created safety for truth-telling. "Your heart has many depths like the harbor," they said gently. "All of them belong. All of them are part of what makes you exactly who you're meant to be." The children who gathered around River and Sage learned to articulate their feelings not as accusations, but as observations, to navigate conflict not as battles to be won, but as opportunities for deeper understanding. Their home developed rhythms that honored both individual needs and collective harmony. Morning gardens where children learned that weeds weren't bad, just plants growing in unexpected places. Afternoon story times with books from Memex Holloway's collection that showed heroes sometimes failing, but learning something deeper. Evening circles where small voices could practice naming their weather without fear of judgment. Maya claimed the role of official greeter, her small presence somehow making it easier for newcomers to settle into the vulnerable work of being completely seen. Finn, as his storm season passed, revealed a profound capacity for sitting with others' difficult feelings, understanding instinctively how to create harbor space for unspoken truths. When other children arrived, some for brief visits, others for longer stays, they found a household that operated on principles of integration rather than elimination, where every feeling was weather to be experienced rather than problems to be solved. The legal processes that formalized their expanding family felt less like bureaucracy and more like ritual, formal recognition of bonds that had already woven themselves into the fabric of daily life. Maya's parents, emerging from their own healing with new tools for emotional navigation, embraced the expanded family structure with gratitude rather than loss, understanding that love multiplied rather than divided when shared freely. Millhaven began to notice the difference in the children who spent time at River and Sage's home. They moved through their days with quiet confidence, able to sit with discomfort without falling apart, quick to offer empathy, and deeply attuned to the nuances of human connection. They were children who understood that the world was complex, but that complexity was not something to be feared, but embraced with patient curiosity. Walking home through familiar streets as evening painted the harbor silver, River felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had discovered that their gift worked best when it was lived rather than just practiced, when it shaped not only their work, but their most intimate relationships. Maya's laughter echoed through rooms that had learned to hold every kind of weather, while Finn's gentle questions helped them all navigate the tender complexity of chosen family. The lighthouse began its nightly vigil, sending its beam across waters that held both treasures and mysteries in equal measure, illuminating a community where children were learning that wholeness included everything and rejected nothing, where they could grow into adults who understood that the most profound peace came not from avoiding life's complexity, but from learning to hold it all with endless, patient love. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice this art of integration, but tonight, surrounded by the gentle rhythms of a family, learning to embrace its own completeness, River felt perfectly aligned with a purpose that could be passed on, generation by generation, like lighthouse beams that reached further by shining steadier. The lighthouse's beam continued its eternal sweep across waters that carried both memory and possibility, and River felt its rhythm settle deeper into their understanding, as the years flowed like gentle tides through their expanding life with Sage and their growing family. The cottage on the bluff had become something more than home. It was a living demonstration that healing happened not through grand gestures, but through the daily practice of creating space where every kind of weather was welcome. Maya, now 15 with hair that caught harbor light like spun copper, had grown into her gift with the same organic grace that marked everything in their household. She moved through Millhaven streets with an intuitive understanding of when someone needed gentle acknowledgement, rather than cheerful distraction, appearing beside struggling neighbors with tea that somehow tasted exactly right, and questions that opened doors rather than demanding answers. Her presence at the circle of both waters had evolved from observer to gentle guide, helping newcomers understand that their difficult feelings weren't problems requiring immediate solution, but weather systems that would move through in their own time. Finn, quieter but no less perceptive, had grown into a young man who understood that strength could be gentle and wisdom could be uncertain. At 17, he carried himself with the steady presence of someone who had learned to weather his own storms and could therefore sit calmly with others who were still learning that skill. His particular gift lay in helping people understand that survival didn't require the elimination of sadness, that they could hold relief and sorrow in the same heart without contradiction. The transformation these young people embodied began to weave itself into the fabric of Millhaven's daily life with the same organic inevitability that marked seasonal change. At the elementary school, morning announcements had grown to include a gentle weather practice. Children placed colored clothespins on a chart to show how their inner sky looked. Blue for open, gray for heavy, gold for hopeful, green for curious, and teachers learned to ask, "What would help your weather today?" rather than insisting everyone feel the same way at the same time. The bakery had set aside a corner table where people could read a single page from a traveling notebook and, if they wished, leave a line for the next visitor. The pages filled with gentle wisdom. You are allowed to take a breath before you answer, and it's okay to bring your sadness to town, and some days, just breathing is enough. A ceramic bowl of smooth stones sat beside the napkins, each one etched with the word both, reminding visitors that they didn't have to choose between their contradictory feelings. Memorial. Services throughout the town began to embrace a broader spectrum of remembrance. When Mrs. Rodriguez's mother passed, people shared not only her tireless good deeds, but also her fierce temper when rabbits threatened her garden, her stubborn refusal to learn to drive, her deep love that expressed itself in complicated ways. The laughter that mingled with tears felt not disrespectful, but deeply authentic, a testament to a life lived fully, holding both light and shadow in equal measure. Weddings, too, took on deeper resonance. Couples who had attended the circle, or sought River and Sage's quiet counsel, began writing vows that acknowledged not just the joyous promise of forever, but the brave commitment to navigate inevitable storms together. During young Thomas Miller's wedding to Elara, River offered a brief reflection about the harbor, how it accepts both incoming and outgoing tides, understanding that true union wasn't about erasing differences but about creating space for them to coexist. Dr. Martinez had begun inviting River and Sage to the He clinic for quiet Wednesday evening hours that weren't appointments but opportunities for patients to sit with their own weather, to place a stone in one bowl and a shell in another, to speak if they wished or simply breathe if words weren't ready. No medical charts governed those hours, only warm lamplight and the understanding that health included sadness, fear, and the slow making of peace with uncertainty. The annual Harvest Festival expanded to include a fallow fields tent, a space for quiet contemplation amidst the joyous celebration. Here people could write down what they were ready to release from the past year, old resentments, anxieties, unfulfilled expectations, and place them into a small ceremonial fire, understanding that letting go was as necessary as holding on, like soil needing rest after bearing fruit. River and Sage found themselves moving between roles with fluid grace, sometimes facilitating larger community sessions, sometimes offering individual guidance, always creating conditions where people could discover their own capacity for wholeness. Their reputation had spread beyond Millhaven's borders, drawing visitors from distant towns who arrived carrying weather they had never learned to name, but they never lost sight of their fundamental understanding that healing happened through patient witnessing, rather than dramatic intervention, walking home through familiar streets as evening painted the harbor silver. River felt the deep satisfaction of witnessing a community, learning to trust its own wisdom. Maya's laughter echoed through rooms that had learned to hold every kind of weather, while Finn's gentle questions helped navigate the tender complexity of chosen family and a town growing into its wholeness. The children who had passed through their home, whether for a season or a lifetime, carried this understanding with them, becoming small lighthouses themselves, guiding others toward the quiet harbor of self-acceptance. As autumn deepened and the community center prepared to expand its healing spaces to accommodate growing interest from neighboring towns, River sensed new currents beneath everything, an invitation to share what they had learned on an even broader scale. The work was ready to grow not through force or urgency, but through the same organic process that had transformed their small coastal town into a place where wholeness was not just taught but lived, where every person could find permission to be beautifully, necessarily complex. The lighthouse began its nightly vigil, sending its beam across waters that held both treasures and mysteries in equal measure, illuminating a community where people were learning that the most profound peace came not from avoiding life's complexity, but from learning to hold it all with endless, patient love. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice this art of integration, but tonight, surrounded by the gentle rhythms of a town, learning to embrace its own completeness. River felt perfectly aligned with a purpose that could be passed on, generation by generation, like lighthouse beams that reached further by shining steadier. The lighthouse's beam continued its eternal sweep across waters that carried both memory and possibility, and River found themselves moving through days that held the gentle weight of accumulated wisdom. Silver threads had woven themselves through hair that still caught harbor light, and their steps carried the deliberate grace of someone who had learned to conserve energy for what mattered most. The cottage on the bluff had become something more than home. It was a living archive of transformation, where every room held stories of healing that had happened one conversation, one moment of witnessed truth at a time. Maya, now 23, and carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to weather all seasons, had returned from the State University with a degree in community psychology and something more valuable: the ability to translate their family's intuitive wisdom into language that could travel beyond Millhaven's protective harbor. She moved through her work at the elementary school with the same organic understanding River had brought to the community center, creating morning weather practices that helped children name their inner sky without judgment. Finn, grown tall and steady like the lighthouse itself, had found his calling with the harbor patrol, learning the physics of rescue and the art of arriving without panic. His particular gift lay in understanding that some storms required patient waiting rather than immediate action, that true safety came from creating conditions where people could find their own way to shore. On evenings when calls had been difficult, he would appear at River's kitchen table, speaking softly about the delicate balance between helping and holding space. The invitation arrived on letterhead from the State University's Center for Community Wellness, written in formal language that felt distant until River noticed the handwritten note tucked beneath the official request. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been quietly documenting their work for years, studying how Millhaven had transformed itself from a town that managed crisis to a community that prevented it through the simple practice of welcoming every kind of human weather. "We believe your approach offers something unprecedented," she had written in careful script. "Not a program to be implemented, but a way of being that transforms everything it touches. Would you consider sharing this wisdom with communities that are ready to learn?" River shared the letter with Sage over morning tea, both understanding that this moment had been approaching like a tide they could sense long before it reached shore. Their work had always been about creating ripples that spread naturally, and now those ripples were ready to meet larger waters. The months that followed brought a gentle expansion that honored the organic nature of their work. River and Sage began traveling to communities that had heard whispers of Millhaven's transformation, carrying with them the simple tools that had always been enough: jars of harbor and rainwater, bowls of smooth stones, and the unwavering belief that healing happened when people were given permission to be completely human. In town halls and community centers, in school gymnasiums and quiet church basements, they would create their familiar circle, placing the waters at its heart. "We're not here to fix anything," River would begin, their voice carrying the steady calm of lighthouse beams. "We're here to remember that everything belongs. Your sadness and your joy, your fears and your courage, all part of the same vast ocean that is you." Back in Millhaven, they began creating what Max Holloway quietly called the archive, though no official sign marked it as such. In the library's corner where forgotten books had once waited for readers brave enough to embrace complete stories, they gathered notebooks from bakeries and clinics, from classrooms and community circles, binding them with cotton cord so their handwritten wisdom could breathe together. A wooden drawer held letters people had written to parts of themselves they had abandoned, sealed in pale blue envelopes and waiting for the right moment to be reclaimed. Nana Rose, now moving with the careful grace of someone learning to walk between worlds, spent her afternoons by the garden window, watching seasons turn with the serene understanding of someone who had lived a life of deep integration. Her conversations with River became less about specific tasks and more about the enduring nature of love, the continuous cycle of letting go and holding close. "You've built something that will last," she whispered one afternoon, her voice soft as falling snow. "Not with bricks and mortar, but with open hearts. That's the strongest kind of legacy. The annual ritual that had emerged by accident and stayed by choice continued to anchor their community's rhythm. On the night closest to the moon that had once cast two shadows at River's birth, people gathered at the long pier with small paper boats folded in kitchens and classrooms. Each boat held a tea light and a word written in pencil, something the maker wished to carry differently in the coming year. They placed their boats on dark water and watched constellations form on the moving surface, understanding that healing happened not through arriving at the same destination, but through the willingness to drift, to touch and separate, to be both lamp and traveler. River found themselves spending more time with the archive, sorting their own pages with the same kindness they offered others. The stories they had written over decades, about harbors that love both treasure and debris, about jasmine that opens to darkness, about compost that makes the richest soil, were organized into plain folders tied with twine. They were building not a monument but a toolkit, meant for ordinary hands in ordinary rooms, for anyone willing to practice gentleness that included honesty. When younger facilitators came to learn, River didn't lecture but put a kettle on, set out the jars and listened to why each had come. "You don't have to be impressive," River would say when someone grew anxious about doing it right. "Just be human on purpose." The phrase lodged in people's pockets like a talisman, simple enough to remember when rooms grew complicated, strong enough to steady hands that sometimes trembled. Walking home through familiar streets as evening painted the harbor's silver, River felt the deep satisfaction of witnessing not just personal transformation, but collective awakening. The work was no longer just theirs. It had woven itself into the fabric of life, carried forward by countless others who had learned to be lighthouses in their own lives. Maya's laughter echoed through rooms that had learned to hold every kind of weather, while Finn's gentle questions helped navigate the tender complexity of chosen family and a community growing into its wholeness. The lighthouse began its nightly vigil, sending its beam across waters that held both treasures and mysteries in equal measure, illuminating a world where people were learning that the most profound peace came not from avoiding life's complexity, but from learning to hold it all with endless, patient love. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice this art of integration, but tonight, surrounded by the gentle rhythms of a community, learning to embrace its own completeness, River felt perfectly aligned with a purpose that could be passed on, generation by generation, like lighthouse beams that reached further by shining steadier. Near the archive's window, River kept an old mirror that caught afternoon light, and on certain days when angle and hour agreed, it offered two overlapping reflections instead of one. They would sit with that doubled image and breathe, remembering the first night they had felt the world widen into its true size, understanding that wholeness still showed itself in small ordinary miracles, as faithful as the tide, as gentle as sleep arriving to claim an overbusy mind. The lighthouse's beam continued its eternal sweep across waters that carried both memory and possibility, and River felt its rhythm settle deeper into their bones as the years accumulated like layers of sediment on the harbor floor. Their hair now held the silver of countless moonrises, and their hands moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had learned that the most profound work happened slowly, like tides reshaping coastlines one grain of sand at a time. The cottage on the bluff had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, though no signs marked it as such. The archive breathed quietly in its corner room, pages whispering as if the community itself exhaled through paper. River spent their mornings there now, sorting through notebooks from bakeries and clinics, from classrooms and community circles, binding them with cotton cord so their handwritten wisdom could breathe together. The old mirror still caught afternoon light, sometimes offering two overlapping reflections instead of one, a gentle reminder of the gift that had shaped their entire life. Maya, now 35 with her own children learning to name their weather, moved through Millhaven's elementary school with the same intuitive understanding River had brought to the community center. Her voice carried the resonant calm of someone who had grown up understanding that feelings were visitors to be welcomed rather than problems to be solved. Finn, steady as the lighthouse itself, captained the harbor patrol with an empathy that extended far beyond maritime rescue, his presence a comfort in both calm and storm. Sage appeared in the archive doorway with morning tea, their partnership deepened by decades of learning to dance with each other's seasons. "The town council approved the Center for Wholeness," they said gently, settling into their familiar chair by the window, a place where the work can continue beyond any individual lifetime. River smiled, thinking of all the times they had resisted formalization, preferring the organic spread of understanding to rigid institutional structures. But they could sense the wisdom in creating something that could outlast their particular presence, ensuring future generations would have access to the simple tools that had transformed not just Millhaven, but countless communities, learning to embrace their own complexity. The afternoon brought visitors as it always did, people arriving with various kinds of weather and leaving feeling more like themselves. River listened with the same patient attention they had cultivated over decades, offering not solutions, but recognition, not advice, but the simple gift of being truly seen. The jars of harbor and rainwater sat on their familiar table, and people touched them when they needed grounding, understanding that both kinds of water were necessary. As evening painted the harbor silver, the monthly ritual began as it had for years. People gathered on the pier with small paper boats folded in kitchens and classrooms, each holding a tea light and a word they wished to carry differently. River walked the familiar path, feeling time thin like tide over sand, soft and generous, revealing small shells of memory smoothed by many seasons. Maya appeared beside them, her own children helping to light the candles that would guide boats across dark water. "What are you releasing tonight?" she asked softly. River held their small boat, thinking of all the ways they had learned to let go while holding on. Inside the folded paper was a single word: worry. Not about their own approaching transition, but the subtle anxiety about whether love could truly be trusted to spread itself without force or management. They placed their boat on moving water and watched. It joined the constellation of lights drifting across the harbor's surface, understanding that some gifts could only be given by letting go, that the most important work often continued in ways its originators never saw or controlled. Walking home through familiar streets, River felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had discovered their individual gift was actually a collective inheritance. The work would continue because it had never really been theirs alone. It had always been the community's willingness to embrace its own wholeness. On a morning when frost painted the windows with delicate ferns, River woke knowing, in the friendly way true knowing arrives, that they had reached a shore from which they would not travel back. There was no dread in the recognition, only attentive peace. They asked to go to the harbor one last time, carried gently by hands that had learned their touch from watching River hold others with infinite tenderness. The water waited with its usual honesty, offering everything it had without performance. Sage sat beside them, Maya on the other side, Finn standing steady behind. They spoke a little, remembering Mrs. Chen's lessons about watering as language, Mex Holloway's lamps turning winter afternoons into tender rooms, Nana Rose's garden where compost became soil in endless, generous cycles. When evening arrived, the jasmine beside their bed released its secret fragrance, and the room filled with welcome that carried both farewell and continuation. River's breath slowed to match the sea's rhythm. Sometimes a single shadow leaned along the wall. Sometimes two met and mingled, inseparable. "I'm not leaving," River whispered, not with bravado but with the simple accuracy of tide. "I'm widening." They closed their eyes, feeling the circle they had helped shape. Sage's sure voice continuing in another room, Maya's gentle laughter guiding younger hands, Finn's steadying silence, neighbors keeping watch, distant towns lighting their own jars of water. The harbor kept speaking, the lighthouse kept turning, and somewhere the moon showed two shadows to a child born into a world that remembered. Morning came. The cottage held the shape of River's living, the way a shoreline holds yesterday's footprints, softly without trying to trap. In the garden, compost breathed. In the archive, pages turned. In far towns, kettles clicked and steam asked its silver question. And somewhere, someone learning to be human on purpose felt a steadiness gentle as a hand on the shoulder, knowing they belonged to everything. And with that, River stretched into the stars. "Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man."